So of course, we have Josh and Nicole and Jan, who you've heard from. For reinforcement on the cognitive science approach, we have Josh is joined here by Nancy Canwisher. Nancy could wave your hand around there. For those of you who don't know Nancy, briefly, Nancy did her undergraduate in biology at MIT, cognitive psychology at MIT for a PhD. Actually did a postdoc in international security and then a postdoc with Ann Treisman at Berkeley. She's the Rosenbluth Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at MIT. Her field is cognitive neuroscience. Nancy uses brain imaging to discover the functional organization of the human brain as a window on the architecture of the mind. And she's perhaps best known for discovering subregions of the human brain that show selectivity for certain categories of images, such as faces, places, and bodies. We have also joining us for cognitive neuroscience approach, somewhere between cognitive science and neuroscience, I'd say. We're joined by Professor Jacqueline Gottlieb. Jackie is here on the end. Jackie became interested in neuroscience during her undergraduate studies at MIT and devoted her scientific career to studying neural mechanisms of attention and executive control. Her undergrad was, again, at MIT in brain and cognitive sciences, a PhD in Yale neurobiology, and postdoc at the National Eye Institute with Mickey Goldberg. She's currently a professor in the Department of Neuroscience at the Kavli Institute for Brain Science and Zuckerman Mind-Brain Behavior Institute here at Columbia University. Her primary field is neurocognition. And she's particularly interested in furthering neuroscientific studies of more sophisticated behaviors. So hopefully we'll talk about that. And last but certainly not least, we have for reinforcement on the computational neuroscience approach, Nicole is joined by Professor Bruno Olshausen. Bruno's undergraduate major was in electrical engineering at Stanford, his PhD in computation and neural systems at Caltech, postdoc with David Field at Cornell. He's currently a professor of Helen Willis Neuroscience Institute and School of Optometry at UC Berkeley. He also directs the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. His field is, again, computational neuroscience, and Bruno's research aims to understand the information processing strategies employed by the brain for doing tasks such as object recognition and scene analysis, and he's perhaps best known for developing normative computational theories of especially early visual processes. Jan, I didn't really bring you any reinforcements. Maybe Bruno is the closest. You're doing well enough at Facebook that we figured you did not need any reinforcements. But I'll help out there for sure. So, and I'm going to sit and join the panel. Let me start by, I want to ask, remember there's going to be some audience participation, but I want to give the three new folks who have not had a chance to do 40 minutes, just 1 or 2 minutes of an opening statement about anything you want to say, but maybe focusing on how you think the fields of cognitive sci, neuroscience, and AI machine learning perhaps should better interact, or you can just ignore my question and start with whatever you like. So maybe Jackie, you're on the end here, so go ahead and then I'll come over here.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks, Jim. Okay, so I'm a neuroscientist, and so of course I love neuroscience, and we generate beautiful brain data, as Nicole said. There's no one like us. At the same time, I believe that if you were to ask any neuroscientist today, do we need interaction with behavior and computation, I don't think there would be anyone who would say no. And the reason is that as wonderful as we are, there are some things that we cannot do by ourselves as neuroscientists. And I think we're limited in two ways. We're limited in that we generate both too much data and too little data. So on one hand, we generate a lot of data. The moment you go into the brain, you pick up this enormous deluge of signals. And the problem, of course, is interpreting and understanding those signals. We cannot interpret, we cannot constrain the interpretations without serious constraints from behavior, understanding the algorithms, and also help from computation to just give us hints of what to look for. The other way we're limited is that we have too little data, and there I am thinking primarily about the types of behaviors that we have been traditionally studying in neuroscience with animals. Those are, you might think that there's a wealth of behaviors that we're studying, but really if you look in detail, they are very, very simple types of paradigms. They're really simplified. Even when we talk about attention and memory, they really are very, very pared down paradigms. And really, the more complex types of decisions that we've heard about in some of these talks this morning, we simply have not gotten to in neuroscience, simply because we don't have we haven't distilled the behavior in simple terms enough to be able to implement it in an animal such as a monkey or a rat, and to really understand how to pare it down and implement it. And so I've experienced this directly in the system of attention that I'm working on. So as many of you know, there are thousands of studies of attention in neuroscience, but there are critical questions about attention that we haven't even touched that has to do with the control of attention. And it turns out that those questions are, in fact, a lot of questions that we've heard here about, which is they're really questions of active learning, and they get right to the basis of learning. How come humans can learn so efficiently and so quickly? We have this magical ability to throw out most of the information and not get lost in irrelevant information. It turns out that that question takes us all the way from things like the efficiency of learning and things like curiosity to why do we make a simple eye movement to a particular location. So it's amazing that there are questions like these that can open up entire new avenues of research that we really haven't even touched in neuroscience. And in order to tackle them, we absolutely need inspiration both from behavior and from computation. So that's all I have to say.
Nancy, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, sure. I'll just identify what I see as one little piece that cuts across a lot of the enterprises that people are doing here, and mention one sort of small cause for celebration and one lamentation. So the piece that I want to identify, I would say this, but I think we need to identify the scope of the thing we want to understand. So we want to understand human intelligence, but it has lots of different kinds of things. Think how different object recognition is from thinking about the content of another person's thoughts. Now, maybe there are general principles that Jan mentioned that will span all of this stuff. He might come up with those. I'm not going to. I think that it's quite possible that these things work very differently. And so one key problem that we all have in all of our different enterprises is first trying to figure out what is a piece we're going to study and what should its scope be. And so in that case, I think there are lots of ways to define pieces of mind or intelligence that have been around for a long time, for example, studies of patients with brain damage. But I will say that I think functional MRI has really given us a lot of progress on that front. I think we now have dozens of kind of candidate pieces of mind and brain that are present in every person that seem pretty fundamental, and for many of which we can really identify, at least at a gross kind of macro informal word model level. Jim hates that, word models, but that's what I mean. We can identify their function, and they're pretty specific. So I think that's helpful in telling us some units to study. And I think that we have some, but of course that's just a sketch of the pieces of the problem to be understood. Of course, we want to do so much more. We want to understand the representations and computations that each of those components does. And they're, in humans, we have some methods. We have pattern analysis and representational similarity analysis, and these are wonderful. But I'll just briefly mention a concern. I think those methods are much too weak for understanding those systems in humans. When they work, we should celebrate. That's lovely. But I worry that a lot of what we see with those methods may be epiphenomena. The effect sizes are tiny. They're often not linked to behavior. I worry about that. I think where there are animal models of these things that we identify in humans, I would showcase the work of Doris Tsao and Venrik Freiwald. What a spectacular triumph those guys have made, and others in that area. But really understanding the face system in monkeys and the spectacular way with the understanding of the actual neural representations, the actual connectivity, not the kind of sort of we're pretending it's connectivity, but real connectivity that you can get in animal models. Causal tests, I think that work is spectacular. And the lamentation I want to end in is, what are we going to do for these profoundly interesting but uniquely human things, like language and music and thinking about other people's thoughts, where we can't fall back on animal models, and where I fear that a lot of the methods in humans, at least the current ones, may not be up to the task. And I'll just end with an example of a huge mystery. Think about what's involved when you take a thought and turn it into a string of words coming out your mouth. Like, I can't even start to think about what a model of that would be like. I don't even know what the thought is in the first place. And yet, I think that's a really deep, fascinating, important question, and I don't know how to approach that, but I think we need to.
Sure. So I guess I live kind of at the center of all three of these circles, and I find myself constantly hungry for more from each of these sides. And I think there's a lot of different ways that they could work together better, more intimately. And so I try to identify a few of those. From the computational side, I think what we really need is a richer set of theoretical frameworks. And so what I mean by that is that much of our theoretical framework now based on neural networks is based on a very old model of neurons, the perceptron, which is now more than half a century old. And we've learned a lot about neuroscience since that model came out. And we've learned that real neurons are much richer computational structures. They do a lot of computation in the dendrites. And so incorporating that kind of structure into our models, I think, would be immensely valuable. And understanding from a theoretical point of view what can be harnessed from that. Incorporating other aspects of neuroscience, such as feedback loops and dynamics, and all this other stuff that we see in brains, I think would be immensely helpful. From the neuroscience side, I think it seems to me right now we have this obsession about the brain. And we oftentimes mean the human brain. And I understand oftentimes there's a push from that from NIH, from the clinical side, and things like that. But from a scientific perspective, if we want to understand the neural basis of intelligence, we really have to think about it from a much broader perspective. And there's animals out there, insects and spiders, which they don't play chess, they don't play Go, but they can stand up and they can navigate in complex three-dimensional environments, and they can do things that we don't know how to do with computers. And we don't know how they're done in brains. And I think we can learn a lot from these extremely much simpler animal models. And I think it's one final thing from the cognitive psychology side and also perceptual psychology side. As Nicole mentioned, this is really, I think, the place we need to look for in terms of thinking about tasks. What kinds of tasks should we be training these systems on? And I think there we really need to think about getting beyond the linguistic bottleneck. So right now, a lot of these tasks are kind of dominated by things that we can observe in overt behavior. So what we can speak out, what we can get out of our mouth, what we can sort of press a button in response to. But Josh gave this beautiful example of, just when you look at that house being constructed, there's this enormous behavior that's inside your head that you can't sort of get out, and as scientists can't observe it, but it's very rich in terms of how we reason about the world. And I think thinking about ways of developing tasks that evaluate your ability to form these internal models and the richness of them would also be immensely valuable.
Okay, so I think those last two comments were a good setup to kind of one of the maybe provocative questions I wanted to ask, and maybe this just blows up the whole meeting, but the whole point, when people say they want to work together, and that was part of Nico introduced us, we need to bring these things together, perhaps can we? Usually there's some idea of a shared goal, I would have thought. And, so I want to, and what success would even look like. So I don't know if even around this table how much agreement there would be on what success looks like. And, thinking from an engineering perspective, if one group decides we're going to go to Mars and that's our mission, another group says we're going to dig a hole to the planet center of the Earth, those groups don't necessarily have to talk to each other. So when I hear you talking about insects and language, and Nancy talking about language, it's not quite that bad, but I want to hear your thoughts on those kind of questions. Are we even after the same thing here? And especially from Jan and the machine learning side, where people say, well, we don't care about the brain at all. We just want to do some engineering. So that's a totally different thing. So if any of you want to comment on that, that's one of my firebombs here. Yeah.
So maybe I'll use an analogy an analogy in sort of the history of science. The invention of the steam engine essentially caused the appearance of thermodynamics as a field of physics. And thermodynamics later explained a lot of things about life, about energy production and consumption in biology and things like this. It helped us understand a lot of things in that respect. Similarly, the example I used in my talk, the design of airplanes, which is mostly empirical, like true engineering in the initial sense of the word, sort of caused the emergence of aerodynamics as a field, as a subfield, and fluid dynamics and all kinds of stuff, right? And the principle that underlie flight for airplanes and birds is the same. That's explained by aerodynamics. The details are incredibly different, and if you talk to certain types of bird biologists, they will, talk for hours on end about the details of how feathers work. And they will tell you it's absolutely critical for the flight of a bird that the feather be designed this way. And I feel a bit the same when I talk to certain neuroscientists who, say, here are all the details of how neurons work, and those are absolutely critical to how the brain works. Yes, they are critical to how this particular brain works, and because of the constraints of biochemistry and everything. But is it really the sort of an explanatory underlying principle that you can use at a sort of slightly higher level of description? And that's where I think there is possible collaborations, alignment of goals, explaining intelligence, but also sometimes divergence in what you think is important for explaining intelligence, and there is from the viewpoint of theoretical computer science, computation is computation. You don't need to compute something on a particular piece of hardware. It might, you change the hardware, it might make the computation more or less efficient, but it doesn't change the nature of it. But I've talked to a number of neuroscientists, maybe not people in this room, but let's say older neuroscientists, who are not ready to accept the idea that you can reproduce a function of the brain on a digital computer, and or at least approximate it, right? That the hardware is actually important. There are even physicists who believe this, right? So I think there is points of contact, possible alignment, but also sometimes divergence in what we focus on.
Does anybody want to add to that?
So I would look, what does success look like, right? Just to start with that. So I would think I'd be a little bit more modest. So as a neuroscientist, success for us in our field means characterizing a system at a particular level of abstraction. For example, even if you look at single neurons without identifying the cells in great detail, characterizing a system in a way that's reproducible and solid. I think that the way we have, for example, for the visual system to a certain level, the way we have for the oculomotor system, the way we have for early levels of the auditory system, that in our field is success, right? And we don't have that for the greatest part of the brain. Maybe the largest parts of our brains are sort of dark matter, associative areas whose function change depending on what experiment you do, and for which we really do not have solid principles. And a lot of higher functions that go with it, we really don't have solid principles. So success, I think for us, is making a coherent story that stands up to the test of time. Now, when it comes to interfacing with other fields, I look at it as more of a set of ideas that are out there, that are available out there. They might or might not be useful for us, but I think that simply putting out a solid piece of data, of evidence, as offering that to other fields such as artificial intelligence, they can use it if they find it useful. Otherwise, they're free to ignore it. So I think this is how the interactions are. They're fairly loose, but anyway. So.
Yeah, I would just say I think it's important to distinguish between short-term or nearer-term notions of success and longer-term ones, right? And I mean many different timescales. I think long-term, maybe not all of us are interested in this, but I think all of us, me and Jan, and I think everybody here, I think why would you come to this conference unless you didn't share some version of a long-term common vision of success, which is to understand human intelligence, because we're humans and we want to understand our own minds, although I'm also very fascinated by insects. But I think we're mostly here. It's not just clinical applications. We're here because we want to understand how we work and who we are, really, okay? And what that understanding means is long-term, stable, reproducible all that stuff. But it means, it means some kind of engineering-like description. That's what the computational means, that we can all agree on, that, produces behavior. But also, cognitive science isn't just about behavior, it's about cognition. It's about the computations characterized at something like a mathematical or software level. But also, what neuroscience is about, I would say, the computations at the brain or hardware levels or all the circuit levels. There's not just 2 levels. But ultimately, it's bridging up all of these things that we'd like to understand. We'd like to have an engineering synthetic description that we could build in a machine that convinces us that we actually understand in all the different ways we mean how our minds work. At the same time, that we have to just recognize that this is incredibly hard, and we may not achieve anything like that, in the time of a PhD or a career or a lifetime, of course. So, I think what distinguishes the different approaches is where are you most comfortable starting, and what do you see as like, the first thing you can get to, which then if you can get to that, then you feel like you have something to build on and take you to the next step. So that's why in my talk at the beginning I tried to characterize the different approaches as like different starting points and different trajectories, top down, bottom up, middle out, both top down and bottom up, and so on. And I think, again, it's to take the analogy, are we trying to go to Mars or go to the center of the Earth or whatever, it might be like, if you're trying to achieve some great construction project, maybe it is to go to the center of the Earth or dig a tunnel into the Alps or whatever, you might have to start from France or Italy, or maybe dig down, you might have to, we don't know which is the right approach, and I think this is, this is the sort of thing where, having people who have different ideas of where they feel comfortable and understand starting with, and trajectories that seem meaningful, surely we can have something to talk about. It's just you have to understand that in the short term, what's going to count as success, what's going to count as like progress, really, might look very different. And trying to build common languages for understanding what our each different notions of progress are will help us actually build the long-term bridges that we need.
I sort of said this before, but I think it's sort of an answer to your question. An example of short-term success, in my view, is the work on the face system by Tsao and Freiwald and others, right? I mean, so they have, identified a system that's characterized in quite spectacular neural detail with a lot of information about the nature of the representations at multiple stages in a hierarchy, which can be modeled and are being modeled to some extent with deep nets, which fit some of the behavior from humans, which are probably homologous to the human system. And, that enterprise is not done, but it's pretty spectacular. So if you allow yourself to say, okay, let's not try to understand the whole thing at once. God help us do that. Let's take a piece. Here's a natural kind. It's a piece. And I think that there's huge progress on that piece. So that's a kind of success.
Okay. The audience is welcome to start asking questions. There's mics around the room. I know there were a couple people that wanted to ask things, so please raise your hand. I see one here. Yeah, and then.
So the question is related to George's talk. You mentioned the importance of learning causal models quite a few times. But in the examples you mentioned, like for example, probabilistic programming and the example in one-shot learning, most of the causal structure is is specified by the user. For example, in probabilistic programs, you have to specify the arrows among the variables. And in the case of one-shot learning, you actually have like the causal model of how the symbols were drawn. Do you think this is a fundamental problem and that causal structure should be learned, or so do you think the causal structure between the variables involved should be learned by data or should be specified by us as prior information?
Well, okay, I'll try to answer that quickly, but mostly I think we should focus on questions for the panel here. Yeah. I would say I talked a lot about causal structure and a little bit about learning. I didn't talk at all about learning causal structure. I do believe that's something that brains can do, but often maybe in somewhat limited or slow ways. I think we do a lot of learning with causal structure, right? Like a physics engine might have a lot of causal structure to it, and we can learn in it. We can learn about objects, about their properties, about how forces work, including ones that have existed for forever, like gravity, but also things that only existed in interesting ways for us now, like magnetism or other kind of weird forces that humans have only harnessed recently. Yes, I mean, I think it is a really interesting question. How do we learn the causal structure that might get wired in, or that's wired into one of those physics engines? But a lot of that learning might be offloaded to evolution. Other kinds of learning are things that unfold over a couple of years or number of years in development. And I think just to turn it back to something that Jan said, and maybe this is of more general interest to the panel here and everybody, Jan raised the question towards the end of his talk, how many learning algorithms are there? Is there more like 1 or more like 50? I don't really know what the right, sometimes I think it's a few, sometimes I think it's more like 50 or whatever, but I think there's definitely, and I hope we would agree, that there's going to be learning algorithms that are on different time scales and very different kinds of learning algorithms. So I think one idea that we've been exploring in our group is a notion of learning that looks very different from stochastic gradient descent or any of the traditional, say, learning rules in computational neuroscience or mathematical psychology, and something that we sometimes call the child as hacker or like learning as programming. So something like, if your knowledge is a program, then learning is something like programming, modifying the program to make it better. There are techniques in computer science called program synthesis, and I think increasingly those techniques are now becoming machine learning and AI techniques and computational models of human learning, and there's really exciting places where those link up with neural networks too. So last year at NIPS there was an exciting workshop on something like neural abstract machines and program synthesis, and I think that's an area where you're going to see all sorts of action, and already there is action on the machine learning AI side, and I want to draw this community's attention to it, because I think where that's going to matter in the brain sense is viewing learning not just as a thing that goes on in synapses or in connections between neurons, but a whole brain activity, where large swaths of the brain are implementing some kind of program like a simulator, and then learning is going to mean a much more global activity of modifying that program in all its parts and pieces, just like we do in coding. So again, if people want to go in this direction, we could, but I think it's really interesting to ask, let's say we take the topic of learning, how close are we? Do we know what counts as a model of learning? What do our different fields have as perspective there? Something I'd like to hear the other panelists' views on that.
So yeah, that was one of my other questions here, which is you talk about models. Nancy used word model, you used model. I think our fields all use these words models differently, and that's one point where maybe there could be more convergence, or maybe we're just, again, doing different things. I mean, I think, first of all, building models is a way that we define our field's understanding, and so in some sense that is a concrete definition of whether you went to Mars, or that's what your models are able to predict, and what domain they're able to supposedly work over is a statement of accomplishment. At least that's the way I think of it. Maybe you guys want to push back on that, but in a way it's sort of I'm asking each of you what would a success look like in a concrete way. You want to build a model of X, and X is the domain is what, and the range is what, or you say no, I don't want to build models at all, which I think maybe some of us would have to push back on, but maybe I could hear from each of you, or at least some of you, what you think the next domain and space of domain and range should look like, which is to Nancy's point about defining some space that you want to work in. Or maybe that's the way I think about it. That's maybe not the way all of you think about it, but especially Bruno or Nicole, you, and then maybe Jan, I see you haven't said much here yet. You guys.
And that's a really big question that could be answered quite extensively. I think one of the points I would like to get across is I think that one thing that's very important to me as a computationally motivated neuroscientist is model interpretability. So really having models whose components lead to understanding, and not just models that seek variance accounted for. So a model that works, but I don't know how it works, that's not as useful to me as a model that might account for a little less variance, but whose components I can interpret. And I think that's a big tension in our field right now between models that work and we have no idea how, versus models that don't generalize very robustly but don't work very well. And I think that navigating that is going to be an important and tricky next step.
Yeah, I thought we might have some disagreement at some point. Yeah, I'm actually more interested in models that work than models that are necessarily explanatory. I mean, pretty much all models have some explanatory power, even if they are a little opaque. It's much easier to analyze a large convolutional net than poking electrodes in the visual cortex. So regardless of what your model is, it's going to be easier to interpret than whatever else, what the alternative. But I think it's very important for models to actually do something useful, to actually work. So otherwise we have vacuous models. And there's been, I think, a transition perhaps that occurred, around, during the 1980s, 1990s, where theoretical neuroscientists had models that were conceptual, had, for example, learning procedures without objective functions, or things that kind of explain perhaps, or how, or predicted how synaptic efficacy would change with time and certain things, but without actually be detailed enough to build functional models that actually work. A good example, a very specific example, is STDP, spike timing dependent plasticity, for the computer scientists among us. So this is clearly something you can observe in a certain number of synapses, a large number, I suppose. And is it enough to explain how the brain learns? Like, is all that the brain does for learning STDP? And there are some neuroscientists who kind of believe this, that if you build a large enough computer and you simulate a large enough neural net and you have it learn through STDP, AI will emerge, right? I mean, I'm kind of simplifying a little bit, but there are people who kind of sort of believe this at some level, and I don't believe this personally. I think you cannot expect a system of that complexity to work without really understanding underlying principles. You can, to some extent, build an airplane without really understanding aerodynamics, but you have to do sort of empirical. You have to understand what the principles are still, even if it's only at a qualitative level. I think for intelligence, or for AI and understanding how the brain works, you need to, whatever model you build, this model needs to actually do something useful and work in the end. That's an essential characteristic, I think, of a successful model. And to some extent, one of the success you were asking about how you measure success, you tell me, maybe it's a question for you, but as someone who has used convolutional nets as a model to kind of, as an explanatory model for the visual cortex, listening to some of your talks, I consider this a success of the interaction between machine learning or deep learning and neuroscience, at least, to some extent.
Right. So now I'll maybe take out the panelist hat a little bit. So I consider what you just said that is a success, but here was exactly the tension that Nicole brought up. So models from AI being used to make predictions and explain variance terms in the brain is a great success, although we don't, some humans are not happy with their ability to understand such models, and that was sort of what you hear Nicole saying, and others, and some of them are the audience, and you might say this too, is Giannis, I'd say, of course we understand them. We built them. There are principles that are applied to how they were constructed. We just don't understand them in the terms that maybe people would have liked or hoped they would have understood them. So,
right. So interestingly enough, this is a tension that also exists between machine learning people and computer vision people, where an initial reaction of computer vision people to models like convolutional net is, yeah, okay, maybe they work, but they don't help us understand how vision works, like image formation, things like that. Like, we don't learn anything from it about how vision works. Now, I have a terrible confession to make. I actually have no interest in vision. I don't actually care how vision works. I care very much how you learn vision. I care how you learn everything else. I mean, I'm really kind of, obsessed by learning. What result is produced by those learning algorithms, I don't actually care very much, as long as it works.
There was probably audience questions here, so let's see. So guys, and just to be clear, we were running 15 minutes late, so I hope but that's okay, I hope. So we're going to cut into the lunchtime a little bit. So there were some more audience questions. I can't see the mic, so who's ever got it, start talking or go ahead. General questions to the panel.
General, I think general. Going back to Josh presented Mar's basic principles, and as I remember reading Mar, the implementation level is sort of the boring, working out how the brain does it, but with the problem was solved without going to the brain. Can you think of examples where neuroscience has actually inspired understanding of algorithms?
Well, okay, just because Mar maybe suggested that the neuroscience level or the hardware implementation level was either the least exciting or the last one. That doesn't mean that should be right. Yeah, but personally, I have argued in my own work, and I have found a top-down approach to be the most valuable and compelling for me and from cognitive science, because I just think we understand a lot of things at the computational and sort of software algorithmic level that we don't yet understand at the neural level. But that doesn't mean that the neural implementation is the most boring or least important. It just might be the hardest, the big, that might be, you said we have our eyes on the prize. As far as I'm concerned, at least when I come to a conference like this, or when I think, why am I really happy that I'm in brain and cognitive science? Why did I go to this department for my PhD as well as for my whole career? Because that's the same prize. I mean, ultimately, like Jan, sometimes I do work on building AI, but I actually do care about vision as well as learning, and I really care about the brain. I think it's really quite a remarkable. I mean, I think it's one of, if not the greatest problem in science. How does this machine inside of our skulls work? So this is a general answer. I just want to make it clear that for people like me, or maybe for Mar, who've decided that the most valuable approach for them and with their toolkit is to start at the top and move down, it doesn't mean that the hardware implementation level is the least important or interesting. It might be the most important. It just might be, just like if you're interested in space, you start off with rockets in your backyard, and then you get to the moon, even though, of course, what you're interested in is, going to another star system or another galaxy, all right? But that's just another way of saying, no, I don't have great answers to your questions. I think there are things like, for example, there are a small number of neuroscience discoveries which really influenced how everybody thinks. So, I had a little slide, a figure from Hubel and Wiesel on there. Certainly that was central in. I mean, I think, Jan, you've said this, right? Like, you've said this, Jeff Hinton has said this, Fukushima said this, that made us think about why what kind of architectures should be used for vision or just pattern recognition or whatever. Okay. Similarly, like grid cells, for example, that was a discovery, justly recognized with the Nobel Prize because it wasn't expected. Although as soon as it was discovered, there were lots of people coming in and thinking, oh, well, that kind of makes sense. Oh, that's weird. That, trying to think of computational accounts at multiple levels, and it's generated a lot of rich theory. And and then people are looking at grid cells, 3D grid cells, and bats, and conceptual grid cells, and that's an example of something that really helped to think about. People have talked about spaces of representation in the brain, but helped to really enrich that that across all the levels. But honestly, I don't think there's a huge number of such cases that really are bottom-up things, really changing things. But Jan likes to cite history of science. I think the history of physics is suggestive of that too. That if you look at the history of physical science, it usually moves in the top down. Every so often, somebody discovers some, thing, but we maybe as we get more and more tools, I think like whole brain, various ways to image all the things that are going on in many neurons at once are going to lead to those things. But at least in the early days of inquiry, most of the discoveries and the progress in physical sciences and I think in the neurosciences is going in the top down direction.
One of the areas I think where the neuroscience is going to be very important for understanding from the implementation side, which is kind of like, I think to a lot of, the way this sort of presented in MAR, that's like the most boring level. And I think that's going to turn out to be one of the most important ones right now because of energy consumption and efficiency of computation.
I totally agree with that.
Right now, these data centers that are computing all these neural networks consume megawatts of power. And so the engineering community is really up against a wall about this and against the wall of Moore's Law, the end of Moore's Law and things like that. And they're looking to the brain more and more for inspiration because they want to know how do you implement these computations at such low power in just 20 watts in the human brain.
I think that's the most important point.
That's just tremendous.
Why should engineers care about the brain? That is the single most important one.
Right. And it's also, I think, to me, I sort of feel like we're going to learn that you can't really divorce these levels of computation and implementation. That we sort of grew up on this Turing model that you can sort of think about that independent of how it's implemented. And I think we're going to have to think about these things more and more together simultaneously, and that's the way brains evolved.
And another audience question. Question over here. There's hands up all over, but I don't know where the mic is, so who's ever got it?
Hi. I'm wondering, given especially this last sort of question, whether we could think about an integrative measure of success, which is, sure, let's build an engineering thing that does some kind of intelligence in silico, but then apply all of the methods we learned from neuroscience about analyzing what underlying representations there are, apply that to the hidden layers, and then choose the ones that have representations or structured learning that looks more human-like. And so that would sort of have an integration between the engineering approach and Nicole's approach, or other sort of people on the panel that we're talking about. And so it's midterm, it's both short-term and long-term, but it's always a separate measure, which is integrative. At which point did brain level of analysis applied to how an algorithm did something give us something that worked for both fields?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent comment, and I would love to see more of that happening. If you have an artificial brain, you have a power to analyze it in a way that real brains are hard to gather data from. And so, yeah, I would love to see more of that happen.
Even with the feeble learning algorithms that we have today, where we try to kind of solve complex problems that are perhaps fairly high on the hierarchy of what we consider intelligence, like dealing with language or reasoning and things like this. Spontaneously, just because of engineering reasons, we come up with things that, after the fact, we realize the brain does also. Not because people do experiments to discover this, but just because we all of a sudden reinterpret the neuroscience literature. So, for example, a class of model that's very successful at the moment for, or very kind of, people are really interested in at the moment for language processing is something called a memory network, and it's basically a recurrent neural net with it's sort of a hippocampus on the side, sort of an associative memory that can store things quickly and recover them quickly. Which basically plays the same role as what a number of models of the hippocampus play. And this was not suggested by the hippocampus, although after the fact you say, yeah, sure. I mean, it's obvious that you need this for this. It's kind of a scratchpad memory. So I think we're going to see a number of things like this that pop up. I mean, the same. I sort of alluded to this in my talk, but the idea that neurons should basically be rectifiers, and there is some sort of contrast normalization that should take place. A lot of people who study V1 claim that this is taking place. A lot of those models, when you put those in, they work better, right? It's not like we have great theory for why, but this is a way of getting a bit of inspiration from neuroscience without necessarily having kind of it coming from grandiose theory. It's more empirical.
Yeah, if I could just add to that again, I love that comment. And this is when I say reverse engineering, that the way I think this is going to go, just again, I'm wearing my panelist hat now, is that we define domains of behavior. We try to build models that can actually perform in those domains, which is much what I see Josh and Jan trying to do. And that's classically, in some sense, AI. But if you build them in the spirit where they have components that are brain-like, which is what neural networks look like, then you can then use the brain data to constrain your search over the space of models to zero in on a model that is actually the one that's most like the brain. And that, I think that is the way forward. That's sort of, Josh calls that the middle out approach, I think. But that, it's not driven by bottom-up principles.
I would call that maybe the joint top-down and bottom-up.
But,
like you and Dan have articulated that very well when you say, the intersection of sort of neural architecture principle constraints and top-down, computational thinking.
Well, and I should mention, there are programs like IARPA's running a program right now to try to do these kind of things. So people are trying to execute this in an engineering sense. It just requires large amounts of data and model searches and people committed to that kind of vision. And maybe the one thing I know Nico wanted to talk about, I'm looking at Nico over there, is I mentioned tasks, it's come up a bit, but one of his questions was, is there a space, I sort of started with, well, define a space of tasks that we might work on. Is there even agreement, and Jackie brought this up at the beginning, that we're just scratching the surface at the animal level. Josh and Jan's tasks, especially Josh's tasks, look very far away from the things that many of us, like maybe Nicole is looking at. It came up in a question in Nicole's talk. Should we, how do we progress in the task space? We have, OpenAI universe tasks, and there's many people thinking about this, but maybe some comments from all of you on what should the next generation of tasks look like for this community, because that's a possible point of convergence. Maybe Josh and Nancy have to move a little down, and maybe some of the neuroscientists have to move a little up. But
dude, I've been moving.
Maybe Jackie or others want to say something about the task space. Especially Nico wanted to talk about this.
So actually, this is one instance where the search for better task was actually motivated in a bottom-up fashion. In my case, it actually came from not from really wanting to look at complex behavior, but from wanting to explain the responses in a class of neurons that we find in the middle level of the eye movement systems that seem to report some sort of decision, which everybody knows are there and they're happening, and nobody has an explanation to. So this was an amazing realization that took me a while, and also to convince my colleagues that there's even a question to explain, because these responses are so obvious, sort of like the apple falling from the tree. Why is it even a question? Of course, the apple falls from the tree. So actually defining, so maybe this is an example of this example of so needing more, so realizing the need for more complex tasks. It's sort of a funny case sample where this happens coming from a very reductionist perspective, where it was very clear that just this perspective is not enough. You actually have to make the task a little more complex, or are thinking about them a little more sophisticated in order to explain the neural responses. So yeah, it's not all top down. Yeah.
Questions from the audience?
Yeah. I have one question about what kind of models we should be trying to pursue. And it comes from the realization that a lot of the models that we have from neuroscience are either molecule or single cell based, whereas in machine learning, like Jan mentioned, we have very elegant and concise global objective functions. They seem to be approximating each other to some extent that we're realizing now. But really, to take the next step, the objective functions that we know now don't implement the higher intelligent functions that you mentioned. Should we be looking for, plus they're not biologically plausible because single neurons cannot have access to all the information required for gradient calculation, right? So should we be looking for more emergent properties that derive from single cell biophysical models, or should we be trying to push the envelope on more elegant objective functions that somehow derive higher function?
Bruno, do you want to take that? It's
Sure.
relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you want both of those. I guess I would just say from the neuroscience end, I think why not start with something like the cortical microcircuit? And let's try to understand what that is. That's a very strong constraint. That's something biology is telling you is everywhere in the cortex. There's a very specific circuit about how these layers are organized, and that's nowhere in our models. We just sort of stack layers and stuff like that, and kind of amorphously. And it's a very salient structure in biology, and I think it's telling us something enormously important. So starting with something like that, where you have recurrent loops and computation in the system, would be very valuable. But ultimately, you want to understand that in terms of some kind of objective function. You know, what's it doing, and how can I sort of understand the sort of larger systems view of it? And so you want both ultimately, and go back and forth.
I was just going to maybe take the opportunity of your question to push on a tension between some of the panelists here, which I think is an interesting one, right? So, do we really know, like, what is brain-like computation? What is brain-style computation? I mean, I think, Jim and Dan Yeamans have really nicely articulated this as saying, okay, well, there's a certain thing we do seem to know, which is what has worked in, the ventral stream and ventral stream inspired models, like in Jan's models and deep convolutional nets. And it seems like there we have some idea of how to make the correspondence between the pieces of our engineering models and the pieces of the brain. But it's much less clear to me that we have that understanding more generally. And that includes what Nancy's saying, like when it comes to language. I think the correspondence between any kind of neural language model and the brain is far more distant and less clear and less solid or dependable at this point. Or when Bruno's talking about the really compelling challenge of how does this machine work with the kind of energy requirements that it has, right? So I guess maybe what I would like to put out as a challenge for people is maybe people could try to say, how much of brain style computation do you think we even really know, or are there big things that we don't know? Or if we are going to look for new motifs, principles of neural architecture or computation that would constrain our models from the bottom up, if you like, where would they be? So the microcircuit is one good example. Are there other ones like that? I guess I would say for me, going back to also the task thing, one place where I would want to look and why I'm working on the tasks that I am and why I spent all the time talking about intuitive physics is I do think the notion of objects, I mean, again, this is the cognitive scientist perspective, but moving us from thinking about objects in the sense of object recognition, which is, again, a pretty big success story at this point, and face recognition is part of that, to the notion of objects that you see in a physics engine or in intuitive physics, like a thing you can first grasp in your mind in order to then grasp in your hand, or in your claw or your pinchers if you're an insect. My daughter was just fascinated by an ant carrying a piece of food that was much bigger than the ant near our house. We've all been fascinated by that. So yeah, ants, orangutans, mice, they all manipulate objects in ways that are more impressive than any of our engineered systems. And we don't know how the brain represents objects in that sense, right? We don't know how the brain represents an individual object. And another one that you could pick this one up and put this on top of that one. What cognitive scientists have called object files sometimes. There's actually, again, a lot of work, not just behavior, but in kind of software level abstractions of how the mind might grasp a few or more objects. And I think it's a great opportunity to both this is a task focus, but it's a task that can be studied in many different kinds of nervous systems. And it's the question that it poses for computational neuroscience is one that we don't have answers to, but we're not that far from having answers to. Unlike language, which I think we're just much farther, right? We have some good places to start looking. So I would suggest that we start looking there. It might be things that people call the binding problem. It might be looking at object tracking circuits. It's those kinds of things. Like motion is a key psychophysical determinant of object identity and object tracking. We know a lot about how motion is detected. So looking for how the brain is basically picking out those signatures of a few individual objects for the purpose of this kind of manipulation would be a good thing to look at.
Okay, I think we're kind of near the end of our time here. I want to, maybe if I could just have one more minute, I would like one or most 2 sentences from each panelist for the graduate students in the audience, especially maybe postdocs, that says, given what you see today, what should they be, with these 3 fields? Maybe your answer is like, do all of them, but, give your advice to the graduate students of, the future of the field, of what they should be working on or studying now. And if that's in one sentence, whatever you say.
You start.
Should I start?
You start.
Oh,
Give me time to think.
So is that a surprise? I thought that was on the list. So I think they should be figuring out how to do a combination of modern model building in combination with some kind of empirical data collection, whether it's behavioral data or neuronal data. And the merging between those two is what they should figure out how to focus on in some domain that interests them. And that's how progress will occur within that domain.
I would say read a lot about animal behavior and learn lots of math.
I would pick up on the biotechnology revolution, and I think interpreting some of those causal experiments is going to require a huge computational effort, which is going to require dynamic models, not just simple static descriptions of neural processing.
Yeah, run math, that's not a bad idea. But if you're a grad student, you're probably too old for this already. Sorry, no, that's not true. I think you want to keep your eyes on the ball. And, different people here have different balls to look at. But, and I mentioned one during my talk, which is, what's the learning algorithm of the cortex? If there is one. So perhaps make the hypothesis that there is one, and then try to look for it. And that might require all kinds of new experimental methods, new modeling techniques, new concepts in machine learning like adversarial training and others. And the kind of stuff Bruno was advocating.
Yeah, I would agree with all of those things. But I would say, for this audience, in this era, computation, that is your friend, right? And learn more math, but learn more computer science. And don't think that what is currently, as great as the success of neural networks has been recently, or Bayesian methods, a few years before, whatever. Don't think that what seems like the current fashion in computation at the time you're in grad school is going to be the only kind of computation you're going to need to learn. Don't believe stories where people say, we used to think this was the way to do it, but no, then that turned out to be wrong, and now we know this. Because those stories always come back to bite you, right? Like, people were saying that even just 10 years ago about neural networks, that was the old thing, and now we know it's this. So, learn as much computer science, and I don't just mean coding, but there's a great, the world of engineering is full of things that not only if you learn, they will help make all of your work better and all of your thinking, but you'll then feel like you have that whole world accessible to you as the tech industry and as the whole business of, the engineering side of computation advances. You want to have the skills to be able to always be learning from that, and ideally, if you can, even contributing to it for your whole career.
Okay, yes, definitely learn a lot of computer science. I totally agree. But I would also say study and read about and think about human behavior and human cognition. I mean, introspect, for God's sake, right? You can see, I'm serious, people diss introspection, but you can watch yourself do all this spectacular stuff in perception and cognition, most of which we don't have a freaking clue about. So introspect, and that's a good source of problems to study. And number 3, please, please, please go invent better methods for human cognitive neuroscience. We are getting left so in the dust compared to animal neuroscience, and it's really sad. So go invent new methods, please.
Yeah, so, well, what can I add? I would say, of course, learn as much as you can about behavior and quantitative fields. Try not to get lost in the details. Try to abstract the principle in everything you learn. And lastly, just follow your curiosity, because research is an intrinsically motivated activity. It's driven by curiosity. And ultimately, we can think best about stuff that we like and stuff that resonates with us. So after all this learning, just follow what feels best. And
Okay. So I'd like to thank all the panelists, and we could give them all.